Hello, welcome back. I've taken that 2 rib that we're air drying out of the fridge, and here it is on the bench. We've been drying this since the 14th of October. It's now the 19th, so it's been in for 5 days, and you can see it's started to change colour. Also, if you press it, you can feel the texture's changing. It's becoming firmer. Now, there are some areas here where it's taking a little bit longer to dry. That's perfectly normal. You can see after you pull the initial vacuum, these bags lose the vacuum a little bit. Now, that's perfectly normal. Don't worry about that. It's still doing its drying thing. It's just slightly slower in some areas. Let me show you the other side. You can see, because that bag's been sitting flat on the rack, it's got very, very good contact there. You can see the fat's just starting to yellow and dry beautifully. When we cook this, we'll fry this fat up on its edge like that in the pan and get a good colour on it before we roast the joint. So when we weighed this initially, it was 1.767 kilos, or 1,767 grams. I'll turn that around so you can see it better. We calculated a 15% weight loss, and that works out at 1.505 kilos. I'll just zero the scales and we'll see how we're doing for progress on this. And okay, so there we go, 1683. So we've lost about 75 grams there, and that's brilliant. So we're heading in the right direction. We've still got a little way to go, and yeah, so we've still got about 177 grams to lose here. So I'm estimating probably another 10 days for this, but we'll monitor it after 5 days. We'll pop this straight back in the fridge. What I might do is turn it over and give the other side contact on the rack to speed it along, even up the drying. And this is now ready to go straight back into the fridge, and we'll come back and visit this again in another 5 days. Let's do it. Well, it's been 28 days. This beef has been in the dry aging bag. I've just taken it out and trimmed it up. I want you to come and have a look at this. So you can see here, we finally got down to our target weight. We started at 1767 grams and we've reached 1505 grams. Here's the bag. We've taken the meat out the bag, and obviously because it's been drying for a considerable time, and I did a little trick on this meat as well, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But what we've done basically is, you can see here, we've trimmed off some of the edge fat, some of the dry bits, some of the dried meat. You're always going to get a little bit of trim here which needs to come off, and all you do is you just go around the meat very gently. You don't want to take off too much fat, but just take off any dry edges that you think look a little bit crusty. And you can see the meat's really nice and firm now. It's got a really nice firmness to it. The fat's gone really hard. Obviously that's dried as well. We always take a little bit of that fat off. And you can see you don't get too much wastage when you use a dry aging bag, because it does it very, very gently. Now, let me tell you about the weight loss. I said this has been in for 28 days, and it has. However, this bag had done its job and reduced the weight of this meat down to its target weight after 14 days. But I wanted to dry age this for 28 days, and you may think, well, okay, fair enough. It's dried out after 14 days. How can I then stop it drying out further and still keep this aging, so to speak? So what I do is I keep the meat in the bag, and then pop the bag into a standard vacuum bag. And that goes straight into there. We stick that on the vacuum machine, pull a vacuum, and it seals that bag inside a bag that doesn't allow air drying. So once that's on vacuum, it goes back into the fridge. Doesn't need to be on a rack because it's not drying, but it goes back into the fridge, and you can then dry it for a further 28 days. And what does that do? Well, you'll find when meat dries out, it dries from the outside in. So the moisture comes from the centre of the meat, passes through the outside, so you end up getting a dry crust on the outside. So if you were to take it out after 14 days and then trim that meat, you'd find that you would lose more yield because you're taking off a thick layer of crust. By doing what I do and aging it further for another 14 days in a regular vacuum bag, which isn't a dry aging bag, what happens is over that next 2 weeks, the meat has an opportunity to equalise its dry bits to its wet bits. So you'll find a lot of that moisture from the centre that still exists will go towards the outside of the meat, and it'll rehydrate it. So you'll end up with a much more sort of evenly dried piece of meat. So when you come back down to the meat, you'll see that we have trimmed off the bare minimum. So I would probably say I've got no more than about 100 grams of trim here.
It's worth noting here that the amount of trim taken off from this particular piece of beef would, if this meat had been dried traditionally, been at least double. These bags ensure that you get the maximum bang for your buck when you're air drying meat, because we're not actually getting as much dry crust that we're having to trim off at the end. Just thought I'd mention that because I think it's quite important.
But this is ready to go. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to cook this on the bone.
Well, that's this wonderful dry aged beef ready to go into the pan and cook. If you want to see how I do that, check out part 3 of this video series.